My name is Anne Waters-Bayer from Agricole Association in Germany, which is member of CELEP and part of the IYRP campaign. And my co-author is Hussein Wario from CRDD in Kenya, also part of CELEP and the campaign. And together we made a study of the impact of large-scale green energy projects on pastoralists in the rangelands. National governments, international bodies, and the general public hold many misconceptions about rangelands. And one of the biggest is that they are empty wastelands. In the past, most governments gave little attention to these areas, regarding them as low potential and marginal. Now, however, the global climate crisis and the need to make a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is putting the spotlight on the vast areas where this energy can be produced, and the rangelands have become a new frontier. In many countries, these areas have been used for generations by diverse pastoralist peoples and hunter-gatherers. The ventures into renewables often ignore the rights of these traditional land users and offer them little or no compensation or benefits when the land is converted to alternative use. The Heinrich Böll Stiftung, a political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party, commissioned this study on how large-scale green energy projects affect pastoralists. It wants to highlight this growing challenge with two main aims: to stimulate policymakers to shape the expansion of green energy production in the rangelands so that it does no harm, and to help pastoralists and wider civil society become better prepared to deal with this expansion. In this study, we focused on large-scale land acquisition to invest in solar and wind power, not hydropower. We looked at issues of climate justice and also explored possibilities of coexistence of pastoralism and green energy. The study was based mainly on a literature review, whereby we examined some cases in more detail in the countries shown in this map. And my co-author Hussein also made some interviews with stakeholders in northern Kenya. So what are the current trends in the energy sector? Solar and wind power production is expanding rapidly worldwide in efforts to meet the global demand for carbon-free energy. And the national commitments made in the Paris Agreement and for the SDGs to reduce CO2 emissions. A growing number of countries have set targets for 100% renewable energy by 2030. Some of this energy will be used to produce green hydrogen to meet the increasing demand for e-fuels for industry and transport. National governments and investors have recognized that many rangeland areas are excellent sites for producing solar and wind power. These areas experience high solar irradiation and often high wind velocities. They tend to be fairly flat and are relatively sparsely populated. Potential sites for green energy projects close to cities often face resistance from inhabitants who have more voting and other influence than do people in the rangelands. Cases in India, Kenya, Morocco, and Norway confirmed that some large-scale green energy projects have been set up in the rangelands without adequate consultation with the local land users and without their free, prior, and informed consent. Common property land is usually held by the state in trust for its citizens, but the state often does not honor traditional land rights. It uses narratives of making productive use of unused or degraded land to justify land grabbing for environmental purposes. Investors have acquired large areas for solar and wind power projects, blocking livestock access, fragmenting the grazing areas, and hindering herd movements. This constrains pastoral's ability to be resilient to climate change. Mobile pastoralism is the most viable agricultural production system in the rangelands, but many governments have little idea of what they are destroying. They greatly underestimate the value of pastoralism in terms of low external input food production and ecosystem services, and therefore also attach little value to the land. This puts pastoralist communities in a weak position to negotiate continued use of the land or compensation for its loss. In most cases, during project planning, the pastoralists were not well informed, if at all, about the plans or about their rights, and were not well organized to defend their land or to negotiate terms. When solar farms with ground-mounted panels were set up, the herders lost access to the pasture beneath and between the panels. Wind farms, in principle, should interfere less with grazing, as the turbines have a relatively small footprint in the wider landscape. However, in most cases, the herders felt that their land and cultural rights had been violated and therefore started to resist the projects. One such case is the Lake Turkana Wind Project in Marsabit County in northern Kenya, where a company acquired 150,000 acres, that's about 67,000 hectares of land in 2009, to produce energy. The land had been used by pasture by Turkana, Samburu, Rendille, and Elmono herders. Representatives of these communities went to court in 2014 when construction began and they became aware of the land deal. By 2019, energy from 365 turbines was being fed into the national grid. In late 2021, the court ruled that the land acquisition process for the wind park had been illegal, but by then the wind park was in full operation. The court recommended that land acquisition be regularized. That is, the company should obtain a legal title from the government, and that process is ongoing. Also late last year in Norway, a court ruled that the licenses issued by the government to erect wind turbines on land used by Sami reindeer herders violated the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as it interfered with the Sami's protected cultural practices of reindeer herding. The Sami demand that the turbines be torn down. The dispute continues. Such conflicts lead to lose-lose situations. The projects deprive the customary land users of their access not only to pasture and water, but also to their main source of energy, firewood, yet rarely gave them access to the electricity produced on the land. Energy companies experienced serious conflicts with local people. This led to damaged infrastructure, construction delays, higher costs, or even project failure. In the case of the Kinangop Wind Park in Kenya, after strong and partly violent resistance from local people over several years, the company abandoned the project. It has to be noted, however, that the opposition was mounted by settled crop and dairy farmers, who tend to be better organized for such campaigns than our mobile and dispersed pastoralists. So in summary of the negative impacts, we found that many green energy projects led to land, water, and energy dispossession, interference in livestock migration routes, disruption of pastoral cultures, and decreased resilience of the pastoral systems. If human rights principles and legal systems for recognizing rights to common property resources are not applied, a growing number of pastoralists will lose their land and water to green energy projects and will become poorer. This will fuel more conflict, hopelessness, and emigration. However, we also found cases where good consultation processes were carried out, and the energy company and the local community reached agreement on shared use of the land and water. In Mexico and northern Canada, and also in one Kenyan case, local communities benefited from green energy projects through receiving equity shares in the company and managing community trust funds fed by energy revenues. In Mongolia, during project design, the siting of solar farms took into account the herders' desire to protect high-value grazing areas and water points. In the case of wind farms, the Mongolian herders have access to the pasture under the turbines and power lines and report no negative impact on their pastoral system. Scientific studies have shown that green energy production can coexist with grazing and can even improve animal welfare. For example, solar panels and wind turbines can provide shade for livestock. However, the cases we found of coexistence of grazing and green energy were mainly in the USA and Australia, where pastoralists are ranchers with private land ownership or land leases. They could negotiate directly with the energy companies. The situation is much more complex in developing countries where pastoralists use common property resources and normally have no legal title to the land and water that they use in different seasons. So in our study, we make recommendations for government policymakers in countries where green energy projects are being set up, as well as for those in energy importing countries, such as Germany. For example, the framework for procuring and certifying renewable energy, including green hydrogen, should require that it comes from projects that meet global human rights standards. We also make recommendations for energy companies and project planners and investment banks. But here, we highlight the recommendations for civil society organizations and researchers with a view to protecting pastoralist rights and helping them gain evidence to strengthen their position to negotiate sharing of land and water with green energy projects and sharing of benefits from these projects. Civil society organizations, including pastoralist organizations, should become more aware of the existing international standards and codes of business conduct so that they can exert pressure on governments and investors to adhere to them. They should strengthen capacities of pastoralists to negotiate with green energy projects, for example, in claiming community rights to the common land they traditionally used, legal advice about their human and civil rights, and access to independent conflict mediation. They should facilitate multi-stakeholder planning processes for land use that includes both pastoralism and renewables, and they should advocate for policy change to secure pastoralist communities' resource use rights. Researchers should fill knowledge gaps on the multifaceted value of pastoralism and rangelands, generating these data together with pastoralists and making the information easily accessible to them. They should fill knowledge gaps on social economic consequences of green energy projects in the rangelands. They should engage in participatory action research with pastoralists facing green energy projects to enable the pastoralists' legal empowerment. And they should engage in participatory action research to develop ways of integrating green energy and grazing. In the course of the world's urgently needed energy transition, it is inevitable that green energy production will expand still further into the rangelands. The challenge is to find how this can happen without ousting the pastoralists. Inclusive participatory design of energy projects within multifunctional land use could optimize overall land use efficiency for pastoralism, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, rural economic activities, and energy production. This could create win-win situations for pastoralists and green energy, but only if the voice and agency of pastoralist communities are strengthened so that they can negotiate good terms. Governments will need to manage the energy transition carefully, in open discussion with well-informed civil society, and especially with the pastoralists in the rangelands. Only then can damage to their rights and livelihoods be averted and an equitable transition to renewable energy be made. And we give our thanks for support and information from these various organizations and individuals. Thank you.